This webinar will be recorded and subsequently it will be posted both on the Cuba Program's website, but also on YouTube. So it will be very accessible to you. Our three commentators tonight have all prepared very interesting background papers. And if they agree, we will put them up on the website too. I haven't asked them this yet, so I don't know if they will agree, but I have a feeling they will. And we will go from 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we have three speakers, two of whom are present. The third is working hard with our Technica in order to get connected. We will begin with Elaine White. Ambassador White is currently a visiting scholar at Harvard University. Previously, she was the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Costa Rica, as well as Costa Rica's permanent representative, ambassador to the UN at Geneva. In Geneva, she served as the president of the United Nations negotiations for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Arms, a treaty which was signed in 2017 with only one vote against, 122 nations for, and one abstention. This was a treaty that was reached under strict time constraints, as well as very diverse and sometimes contentious positions. In addition to her work on the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Arms, she has worked in a number of capacities, both in Geneva, in New York, primarily with the United Nations, but also previously as Vice Minister, working to resolve crises in Central America and elsewhere. Our second speaker tonight will be the Reverend Drew Christensen, who's Distinguished Professor of Ethics and Human Development at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, as well as a Senior Fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. He served on the Atlantic Council's Middle East Treaty Force, and he's also served as the Vatican delegate to the negotiations that produced the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Arms. So he and Elaine worked in the same negotiations a few years ago. So I'm glad we could get them back together again. In addition, Elaine, or Drew, I'm getting behind. I've noticed that Hernan is here now and it distracted me. Drew has served as the director of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, Office of International Justice and Peace, and as editor of the Jesuit publication, America. As director of the Bishop's Foreign Affairs Office, he worked in many trouble spots, including Guatemala, Haiti, Mexico, Northern Ireland, Croatia, Bosnia, and he's worked on Israeli, Palestinian, Jordanian, and Lebanese issues. He has been a consultant to the Vatican on the Middle East and Middle East Christians, religious freedom, and nuclear disarmament. I will now introduce our third speaker, Ambassador Hernan Portocarrero. Hernan, can you hear me? Shake your head. Hernan had some technical difficulties, but we're very happy to welcome Ambassador Portocarrero, who's the former European Union ambassador to Cuba, and also prior to that, the former Belgian ambassador to Cuba and the Caribbean. He's participated in multiple global UN conferences, as well as European Union Cuban negotiations. For example, on a comprehensive cooperation agreement between 2014 and 2016, and the UN, or the European Union Cuba Human Rights Dialogue, as well as the global treatment on the ban on anti-personnel mines. The Rome Statute that brought into being the International Criminal Court, and he has served in Ethiopia, Darfur, and Nicaragua during their armed conflicts. Ambassador Portocarrero will provide us with an overview of the different types of negotiations that currently exist and some of the impediments to successful negotiations, as well as those elements that facilitate negotiations. Ambassador White, who will follow him, will focus primarily on UN negotiations as well as bilateral Costa Rican negotiations. And Father Christensen will be our non-governmental representative. He is not representing the Vatican State, but rather he is representing his own opinions as a distinguished academic. So we begin with Hernan Portocarrero, Ambassador Portocarrero.
Thank you, Professor Crahan, and greetings to Ambassador White and Father Christensen. I was not asleep at the controls in spite of the late hour. You know, this is just 1:15 a.m. in Andalusia, where I have the pleasure to live in retirement. I will try to be brief and to the point, and just with two small preliminary remarks. No negotiation is entirely a rational process. You always have to deal with personalities, with ideologies, with tempers. And this is true for all types of international negotiations that we will survey. The other point is that no negotiation starts out of the blue and in a vacuum. In my career, I have worked for a long time as a diplomat for the country of Belgium, which has a very complicated institutional structure. And later on for the European Union, which is even somewhat worse. In all cases, you have to negotiate before you negotiate. You have to get a mandate, you have to look at timing, you have to look at level, you have to look at venues. And all of these things, while some may be symbolic, have a certain impact on content. There are anecdotes aplenty about that. You remember, some of us at least remember, when Dr. Kissinger was negotiating with Le Ducteau in Paris. They spent weeks discussing the form of the table, for instance. This may be delaying tactics, but it's just indicative of how many irrational elements there are sometimes. Now, as to types of negotiations, I would distinguish 3 or 4. The simplest in interstate relations is a bilateral negotiation, 2 state parties sitting face to face. The second type is where coalitions face a party or face another coalition. The third type is the full-fledged multilateral global negotiation, like in the major UN conferences. And then there is a somewhat type apart, which can involve non-state actors that results in specific complications. The example that comes to mind, because I was involved with it, was a negotiation between Colombia and the FARC. Complicated because that's a de facto power. The modalities and the logistics of such negotiations are extra complicated. Now, to begin with the simple bilateral negotiation, it's probably the one where psychology plays the most important role. You have to know your counterparts. You have to understand their personality, also the decision-making process in their political system. And you have to know what the red lines are. That means what is absolutely unacceptable, what is a must, either from their side or from yours. And every bilateral negotiation has a part of horse trading in it. You will start out with a number of demands, knowing that you will get maybe 50% in the best case. The classical example is when Western negotiators sit down with somewhat less democratic governments to talk about human rights. Well, you know that you will get maybe 50% of what you would ideally obtain, and you will be happy if you get 50%. It may be less. On the other hand, the level of negotiations is important. You have to know how much leeway your counterpart has. That depends, of course, on their position in a decision-making system. They can be a minister, a government member, in which case they will have fairly large authority. They can be diplomats who mostly have to refer back to a higher authority. But all of that is on a case-by-case basis, because if you've worked in the United Nations long enough, you know that many ambassadors there are in fact politicians and can give themselves instructions. They may pretend they have to go back to capital to play for time. All of these are classical tricks of bilateral negotiations. In the end, what do you expect from a bilateral? It's a convergence of interest on certain points, or a common interest in as much as it can be defined. I would say that bilateral negotiations were the bread and butter of diplomacy in the past, but that has changed. The weight is much more on multilateral diplomatic work these days. When it is coalitions negotiating with one party or another coalition, the main pitfall is, of course, that coalitions may agree on certain points, but there will be fault lines. And it will be the tactics of the other side to look for those fault lines. The example that comes to mind is what is going on about the Ukraine these days. Theoretically, the West has a shared interest in preventing Russian aggression, but when you look at the details, you see that there is a very dispersed order in what the West wants. NATO wants one thing, the EU, member states want one thing, the EU as a whole wants one thing, the United States has an agenda. And it's, of course, often the less democratic states that have advantages in such a situation. In general, democracies are somewhat at a disadvantage in many negotiations because they have to live with shorter time frames for political decision making. They have issues of public opinion to deal with. They have parliamentary oversight, all of things that less democratic regimes don't have to worry about so much. Often so, in many negotiations, time is on the side of less democratic regimes rather than on the side of democracies. At the end of the day, again, in a bilateral negotiation, as well as in a coalition negotiation, what you look for is a convergence of interests. That means that there will be concessions from both sides. Some of those concessions may be symbolic, they may even be window dressing, they may be psychological, but nevertheless, they are important. I come to, I hope I'm not running out of time.
No, not at all.
I come to what is probably the most important form of negotiation these days, the large multilateral conferences. It's interesting, I started my UN career in 1985, I think, working in the second committee of the General Assembly. And that committee had a tradition of working by consensus. Other committees, typically the third committee that dealt with human rights, brings most things to the vote because there is just no common view on too many issues. But in the second committee, which dealt with international economic issues, consensus building was the norm. And it is actually from that subculture in that committee of the General Assembly that the prepcoms of the later major conferences were born. The consensus principle is, of course, a very tricky one because it means that everybody had to put some water in their wine. But at the end of the day, it's better than to end with controversial decisions that may not be enforced. Now, again, you see an evolution. In the beginning, when the cycle of these conferences started, I would say in 1992 with the first Rio Conference on Sustainable Development, there was still a very reluctant attitude, especially in the G77, the group of developing countries, to join in the preoccupations of the West. That has evolved, not so much because the political systems in many developing countries have changed sufficiently, but because even autocratic regimes have become more image conscious. If they see themselves as the future of the world, as some of them do, they have to at least give in to the definition of a public common good worldwide. And we have seen that in that way, even regimes that were not so sensitive to public opinion have become much more image conscious, and for that reason will join in better consensuses. Of course, the jury is out to see how, for instance, the climate conventions will work in the long run. But I think it is significant also that civil society, which was somewhat marginal in the early stages, is now basically a full participant, and especially can put a lot of pressure on the negotiators. Now, a last point I have to touch on is good faith, bona fides in negotiations. Again, this is a point that's sensitive for democracies because since political change comes with democracy, a continuity in commitments is not always guaranteed. The most striking example is the one after the First World War, when the United States Senate and Congress refused to follow President Wilson into the League of Nations, but there have been more recent examples as well. So it's an issue for democracies that the old rule is pacta sunt servanda, treaties have to be observed, but we know that there is not always a continuity in politics in democracies. And the United States has a certain track record in that regard. So we have to be aware that to negotiate in good faith does not necessarily mean that commitments will be upheld in the long run. I think I will leave it at that. Maybe just to stress again, I worked in environments where negotiating to negotiate was always a challenge. It's almost not a joke to say that in the European Union, it's often as difficult to get your negotiating mandate and to get over the hurdles in the European Parliament than it is to negotiate with the opposite party. But I came from an environment as a Belgian diplomat where I had basically to deal with regions and communities that had taken over much of the matters that the federal state used to deal with. And the result was that if I had to go to European coordination meeting, I had already spent hours negotiating with the Belgian regions and communities. So it was a good school. I will leave it at that. I'm sorry, I'm a little tired, I have to admit, but I try to be coherent. Thank you.
Thank you, Hernan. We took advantage of your claim that you were an insomniac to schedule this meeting. We will have a discussion amongst the three presenters at the end of the three presentations, as well as if time remains, questions for the presenters. We will now move to Ambassador Elaine White.
Thank you. I want to check that you can hear me.
Very well.
Oh, good.
Very well, thank you.
Thank you. So I have to say that I am really honored to be participating in this panel, and I want to warmly thank Professor Meg Crahan and the Center for the Latin American Studies for this invitation, but also for her interest in bringing to the surface an aspect of international policy that sometimes is invisible, which is the art of negotiation to achieve agreements to address international challenges. Negotiations are the pillar of the international system, but what is usually visible is the result of the negotiation. Either you have an agreement or you don't, but that is what usually you see. And not necessarily how behind the scenes that agreement or lack of or failure to achieve an agreement, how that process is crafted, how the negotiation is conducted, and as Ambassador Portocarrero was mentioning, how we negotiate to negotiate and how we arrive at negotiation mandates. So I am very happy also to coincide both with Ambassador Portocarrero and with Father Christiansen, with whom, as Professor Graham said, we were able to share this ad hoc negotiation process that led to the prohibition, to the legal prohibition of nuclear weapons in 2017, a historic landmark for the history of the United Nations. I would like to take this opportunity in following up some of the remarks by Ambassador Portocarrero in terms of three aspects. I would like to use the example of the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, also called TPNW, to make an example, to make vivid examples of certain dimensions of the international negotiations that actually were introduced by Ambassador Portocarrero. And the first aspect that I would like to mention is precisely the negotiation mandate and the increasing role of small states and non-governmental actors, and this so-called diversification of agency and leadership that is an aspect that characterizes today's international politics. It is often said that negotiations should be analyzed in three dimensions: substance, procedures, and psychological or personal dimensions that are obviously part of negotiations, because it is true that we negotiate among state representatives most of the time, although we have more actors, but it doesn't matter who we are representing and whose name tag is in front of us. We are individuals, we are persons, and also we have to deal with personal characteristics. So tactics, strategies, techniques are often discussed and analyzed, but what is usually not talked about is how we arrive at the table, at the negotiation table and at the negotiation mandate. And in the case of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, I will start by highlighting that the negotiation mandate was perhaps, and this Ambassador Portocarrero can help me confirm, but if from my understanding was the first negotiation mandate in the history of the United Nations that it was crafted despite the strong opposition of the permanent members of the Security Council, meaning the nations with the most powerful militaries of the world, and overall all nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear states that depend on nuclear deterrence for their security. That means that this was a movement and a mandate that was geared to the main instrument of security of the most powerful nations. And it was conducted by countries that historically had been, to use these academic terms, had been norm takers and became norm entrepreneurs, in the sense that these countries decided to exert their agency and their leadership to move the needle of the international nuclear debate and to fill a gap in international law that did not have a legal prohibition of nuclear weapons. So this mandate then is a clear expression of how agency and leadership has diversified in today's world, and how a great diversity of actors, being small states, regional powers, non-governmental organizations, religious organizations and leaders, and victims actually take agency. They build coalitions and they decide to lead global processes that decades ago, that leadership to move the needle or to lead global processes was a little bit more dependent on the great powers. Some authors stress that beyond the discussion of where, in geographic terms, power will be centered, whether we are seeing a translation of the center of power from the Atlantic to the Pacific, that we should think of this world as one characterized by a diversification of the locus of power, sources, agency, leadership, in a game field in which states have to share the negotiation room with multinational corporations, with non-state actors, with victims, with persons who are victims, and bring their testimony of their suffering to the international community. In an environment of political, economic, and cultural diversity, also characterized by a profoundly interconnected and interdependent processes. That is a multipolar world, polycentric world, a diverse world in which the game field is much more diverse than what it used to be. So for instance, some decades ago, maybe it was difficult to perceive that small states could lead or facilitate global processes. Now it is very common to see small states like Costa Rica or other perceived small states to see them facilitating global processes and negotiations. I would say that in this process of diversification of agency and leadership, the United Nations General Assembly has played a strategic role because of the legitimacy of the representation of the General Assembly, because it represents all peoples of the world. This is the reason why, I say if the United Nations did not exist today, we would have to create it, because there is no other venue, no other forum where all peoples of the world meet and we see each other's faces and are able to engage in negotiations. And the General Assembly is using the powers that were conferred to it by the UN Charter, specifically in Article 10, that gives the UN General Assembly the power to address any questions or any matters within the scope of the Charter. And the General Assembly, what it does is that by convening ad hoc conferences, the GA has a very important role in agenda setting, the international agendas and agenda setting, and in moving the international community to address universal challenges, by creating new paradigms. For instance, human development paradigm, sustainable development paradigm, or to fill cooperation or legal gaps in the governance structure. To cite an example, very recently in the biennium of 2015, 2016, this was a very pivotal biennium because we saw, first of all, in 2015, there was the peak of the migration and refugee crisis, especially in the Mediterranean. And at the same time, we realized that the international community didn't have a governance structure to deal with the migration and the refugee crisis. So the General Assembly convened two negotiation processes to adopt a global compact on migration and a global compact on refugees. Also in 2015, the General Assembly adopted the 2030 Development Agenda. And in 2015, also under the auspices of the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, there was the agreement on climate change was arrived at in Paris. And in 2016, the General Assembly, on the basis of those powers that I mentioned in Articles 10 and 12 of the Charter, that included the General Assembly can act on even on principles governing disarmament and the regulation of armaments, decided to convene a negotiation process to accomplish the legal prohibition of nuclear weapons that was an aspect pending for 7 decades, actually. This is just a background information or introduction to say, to mention that the leadership of this process to have a negotiation mandate to prohibit nuclear weapons was conducted mainly by a core group of states that was able to build a very strong coalition to move the needle in global negotiations on nuclear disarmament. And this core group was formed by Austria, Brazil, Mexico, Nigeria, South Africa. And also the coalition was composed of more than 120 states. There were states that had already resigned or renounced the possibility of becoming nuclear weapon states in the Treaty of the Non-Prohibition on the Non-Proliferation of nuclear weapons of the late 70s. And these are states, more than 100 states, that also were in regions of the world that had already declared their non-nuclear status. Latin America in 1967, Africa, East Asia, and South Pacific and Central Europe. So this coalition was built around these more than 110 states that were concerned, first of all, because of the lack of progress in nuclear disarmament. Second, they were concerned because of the humanitarian impact that any new detonation of a nuclear weapon would have on the human being and on the environment. And the strategic question then became what this group of nations that were all in compliance with their non-proliferation obligations, what this group of states could do. Because we are clear that the dismantling of all nuclear weapons is the responsibility of the states that possess them, that possess nuclear weapons. So what does the rest of the international community do in this regard? Well, the international community does have a responsibility to create the normative framework that is part of the rules-based international order. And in this case, there were three elements for this coalition to make the decision to move the needle or to seek this negotiation mandate. Lack of progress among the nuclear weapon states, evidence of the humanitarian consequences, and also the recognition and the acknowledgement there was a legal gap in international law that was not treating on equal footing all the weapons of mass destruction, because biological and chemical weapons were already prohibited in international law. So what does this mean to move the needle in this negotiation mandate? And this is when we move to several aspects of negotiating the substance, because part of what we negotiate when we negotiate a negotiation mandate is the extent or the scope of the negotiations, or of the treaty in this case. We have to acknowledge and to have some historic background that the call to abolish and prohibit nuclear weapons grew since the very aftermath of the nuclear detonations in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. The International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement already triggered the call towards the prohibition in 1946, after being the first international witnesses that arrived at both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and were the ones that translated and to convey to the rest of the world the horrific consequences of those nuclear explosions. Also, the scientists that participated in the Manhattan Project that developed nuclear weapons, including Albert Einstein, founded in 1946 the Committee on Atomic Scientists to create awareness on the terrific consequences of nuclear weapons. So in terms of the history of the United Nations, we have to acknowledge that since the very foundation of the UN, there was a very clear statement. The very first resolution that was adopted by the United Nations in the very first General Assembly was taken on board to decide the elimination of nuclear weapons from national arsenals. And we have to acknowledge, as I said, that chemical and biological weapons were prohibited in international laws in the 60s and the 70s, in the 90s. In terms of nuclear weapons, it was in 1968 that the United States and the former Soviet Union proposed to the rest of the world to sign a great deal by which all countries that had not developed nuclear weapons at the time, mostly only the permanent members of the Security Council had done so, that all countries of the world relinquished any aspiration of becoming nuclear weapon states in exchange for technological transfer of technology for the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and that the nuclear states would undertake negotiations in good faith towards total and complete disarmament. After the end of the Cold War, the superpowers reduced by half the nuclear arsenals and committed to continue on the process of disarmament as contemplated in Article 6 of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. So when this process basically halted, the rest of the world was left wondering how to move the needle of nuclear politics and exert leadership and agency in this process, based on the understanding that nuclear weapons pose an existential threat to humanity, and that therefore all peoples of the world have an interest and a responsibility in making progress towards nuclear disarmament. So what was different in this time that allowed for a negotiation mandate to be agreed upon by the General Assembly for the first time in 7 decades? I think there were two elements here that the coalition was able to take on board. First of all, there was a paradigm shift. This coalition of states and civil society and the scientific sector as well developed a new conceptual framework to address the issue of nuclear weapons. One that departs from just discussing the state security to start addressing the scientific evidence that was available at the time to speak of the actual impact of any nuclear detonation on both the people and the environment. So by reviewing the evidence and the scientific evidence of the impact of any nuclear detonation on the people and the environment, that discussion led to the conclusion that any use of nuclear weapons would have catastrophic consequences for humanity, and they should never be used again under any circumstances. And that the only guarantee that they will not be used again is their total elimination. And so there was a new paradigm that was created from the orthodoxy of security of the state approach to the approach of human security. And also to the perception that legal obligations of states are interconnected. So if you have obligations towards human rights and international humanitarian law, you cannot abstract nuclear weapons from the overall set of obligations that states have. After the conclusion that there was a need to make sure that nuclear weapons need to be eliminated, there was a new strategy. Previously, the strategy was to negotiate a comprehensive nuclear disarmament convention that addressed in detail the dismantlement of nuclear arsenals, the verification, the time frame, and also the prohibition. But the international community in this time decided to move the needle to delegitimize nuclear weapons by prohibiting them in international law as one first step. This is the same pathway that was followed to address other weapons, cluster munitions and landmines, and other challenges that humanity has faced: racism, apartheid, slavery. There has been a stigmatization, a prohibition, and then by this prohibition, there is an impact in provoking a change in state behavior. So the United Nations General Assembly adopted a mandate to negotiate a legal instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons. And let's see, let me just go to what the mandate exactly entailed. First, to negotiate a treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons, a wide range of activities related to the life cycle of nuclear weapons, to have a clear and strong and comprehensive prohibition. That the negotiations needed to be undertaken with a sense of urgency, and that the treaty also needed to complement and reinforce the existing legal architecture, basically the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, and also the regional treaties that were already establishing nuclear weapon-free zones in different parts of the world. So with this negotiation mandate on the substance, we go to the procedural dimension of the negotiations. So as I said, the mandate was to have an inclusive and participatory process. Actually, one of the first decisions that were taken by the conference was to give the observer states the right to full participation, including the right to vote, which actually benefited the Holy See and the state of Palestine. The venue of the negotiation was decided that it was going to be in New York. Why? Because that is where all the member states of the United Organization do have a representation. So we were going to be able to have a very inclusive negotiation process. Then we had to work very hard to work on the rules of procedure. And it was central, as Ambassador Portocarrero was mentioned, sometimes procedural aspects become very substantive. And in this case, the strategic component of the procedural decisions or the rules of procedure was that we could have a decision made by majority. That means by a vote. Because if we were to have a conference that could only adopt a decision by consensus, any one of the participating, more than 100 countries participating in the conference could exert a veto, and no decision was going to be made. So this was the strategic difference that we took an aspect that traditionally for decades was decided upon by the rule of consensus. We took it to be decided upon by voting, the rules of procedure of the General Assembly. Two more aspects that I would like to mention. One of them is the strategy to negotiate the text. It was a text that was managed by the president, but as a different procedure than other conferences follow, is that the president puts on the table a text, a proposed text. In this case, what we did was that we did not start the conference with discussing a text, but we started the negotiation process with a discussion of what every state wanted to see in the context of the treaty. That allowed the president and the team, that was myself and my team, to look at where states were converging in their views and propose a text that precisely mostly was built on the points of convergence. And we try to avoid at all moments to include in the text things that were not agreed upon. You know this, how in international multilateral negotiations, we have text that has brackets. So we did not have brackets in this case. So whatever we were negotiating in the text was whatever made it to the text was those concepts were already negotiated in the room. So that's how we managed to win time, because we were working against very important time constraints. And the last thing I would like to mention in this regard, just to leave other aspects for later conversation and exchange among us, is how we were able to benefit from goodwill, from the goodwill of the personnel and the technical support teams of the Secretariat of the United Nations, the translators, the legal advisors, because for a text to be able to be adopted at a conference, it needs to go through many different legal and administrative steps and translation into 5 languages. And we were able to achieve all of those steps in a matter of a record time. So this is something that you don't regularly see, but we were under a very important pressure to deal with all these administrative steps so that the text was able to complete the negotiation process on July the 7th, having completed the whole negotiation process in 7 months. But all the process from the start of the coalition to the adoption of the text was 7 years. And if we consider the start of the coalition to the entry into force of the text of the treaty, it was 10 years. So this is how international negotiations address very pending tasks that the international community has had. Last but not least, let me mention the important role that victims of nuclear weapons played in the negotiations, because they were there with us in the room. We knew we could not fail, and they constantly were conveying to us the reality of what exactly was going to happen if at this moment we have another nuclear detonation. So that is a very important factor. And the last factor I would like to mention at this moment, together with the role of civil society and citizens that really triggered this negotiation process, is the role of religious leaders, the role of the Vatican and of Pope Francis in this regard. was actually pivotal in forging this international coalition that helped to negotiate in a record time. I would stop there, and I'm sorry if I went over the time.
Thank you very much, Elaine. But it was a beautiful opening of the topic of the role, not only of religious institutions, but also of non-governmental entities, which Father Christensen, who participated in the negotiations for the treaty to ban nuclear weapons, but also in a wide variety of other negotiations virtually around the world. So now we will hear from Drew Christensen, who is a Jesuit and also a distinguished professor at Georgetown University. Drew?
Thank you, Meg, and thank you for your invitation to serve on this panel. And thank you to the Cuba program for this special program. I apologize. I suffer from a kind of chronic laryngitis, so I've reduced my talk to some points that I'll make here, and just bear with me as I drink water or suck on my cough drops to keep my voice going. I'm very grateful to be able to be with Ambassador White once again. She ably led the conference to negotiate the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, and to meet Professor Portocarrero, whose preparatory thoughts really helped generate my preparations for this meeting too. I want to begin by talking about my experience of two notable failures. My experience in multilateral negotiations is limited. My experience of diplomacy is largely through track 2 and track 1.5, by which I mean my semi-official representation for the Holy See with various governments or numbers of governments in different situations, particularly in the Holy Land and in the former Yugoslavia. But I did participate in 3 formal multilateral fora that I'll talk about tonight. One is the WTO meeting in Seattle in 1999. The second is the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference in 2015. And the third, of course, is the conference to negotiate the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons in 2017, which is, of the 3, the single success. The WTO meeting was, from the outside, a failure because it was besieged by protesters, anarchists primarily, the whole time, but particularly the first couple of days, making it difficult for delegates to enter and so on. But it really collapsed because of the ham-fisted way in which the Clinton administration managed the meeting. We were observer members in the Holy See, so we expected to walk the corridors. But when we walked the corridors, we were constantly meeting delegates from developing countries who had a right to sit in small meetings. And the small meetings where the real business was being done on various topics that were being negotiated. And the Clinton administration arranged the meeting so that only the major industrial and major agricultural states sat in rump sessions without the third world countries being there. And so the meeting really ended in failure, which has haunted the WTO ever since, because there was so much domination and manipulation by the US at that meeting. The NPT in review conference in 2015 really dealt with a lot of sensitive issues, and one which an issue that had been endorsed twice before was a proposal for a Middle East nuclear free zone, and it was on the agenda that be proposed, but the US, together with Britain and Canada, prevented a conclusion to the meeting, which usually comes in a consensus statement of the sort that Ambassador Porto Carrera talked about, by refusing to join a consensus. So we had a chairman's report at the end rather than a consensus report, because the US wanted to protect a non-member from the embarrassment that a nuclear non-proliferation zone and a nuclear free zone, rather, in the Middle East would present to the state of Israel, which is an undeclared nuclear power. So of these, and I will talk more about the success of the conference that Ambassador White led in a few minutes. It was the only success that I participated in. Otherwise, as I said, my work usually was in track 2 and track 1.5, where I was a semi-official representative of the Vatican. In his address to the diplomatic corps in January, on January 10th, Pope Francis spoke of violations of solidarity and a multilateral world order as being reasons that people don't trust international institutions or diplomatic arrangements. He wrote this: important resolutions, declarations, and decisions are frequently made without a genuine process of negotiation, in which all countries have a say. This imbalance, now dramatically evident, has generated disaffection towards international agencies on the part of many states. It also weakens the multilateral system as a whole, with the result that it becomes less and less effective in confronting global challenges. The Vatican, through its diplomacy over several decades, has tried to emphasize inclusiveness, the inclusion of states, both strong and weak states, but also cultures and peoples in the international system. And one of the reasons that I think it was so active in the conference on the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons was it was interested in those who were marginalized, who were represented there. The non-nuclear states, the victims of whom the ambassador talked, as well as the victims, not only those of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but also those of testing in the various island states or in Australia, or of mining and test explosions where the downwinders were affected and their families were affected with illness due to radiation, who are concerned because they're forgotten, set aside by the major powers as being inconsequential. And the Holy See has tried to see that they be included, and its participation in a whole series of negotiations in the last couple of decades to prohibit cluster munitions, landmines, and the treaty on arms trade. All that was part of its concern for human security, where you put the emphasis on human rather than just on security understood militarily. In contrast, there's a contrast between Seattle in 1999 and New York in 2017. And it is the presence of the victims and of civil society more generally in those meetings. In Seattle, there was a forum for NGOs across town, but there was really a serious tension between the leading developing states like India and the INGOs, the international non-governmental organizations, who were activists there in Seattle, because the leading developing countries felt they represented their people, and who were these self-appointed activists to think that they could shape the agenda? And so there was a real tension there. But by 2017, as Ambassador White Gomez has said, civil society was welcome. The General Assembly welcome the participation and the presence and the participation of the non-governmental organizations. And they were really included in everything but final votes and small negotiations. We'll talk about that maybe in the question and answer period. The Holy See had multiple roles, and one of its roles was that it had been part of the humanitarian consequences movement, of which Ambassador Laikoma spoke, which went on from 2013, a meeting in Oslo, to the end of 2014 in Vienna, where states and civil society took a look at the scientific evidence for the human effects of nuclear warfare, and particularly the inability of anyone to be able to pick up after a nuclear war. It also then got involved with preparations, and the Holy Father was invited to help introduce the first session in March of 2017 of the meeting. And the Holy See again was asked to sign and ratify as one of the first countries the treaty when it was actually presented on the 26th of September 2017. And Holy Father went ahead to host a conference for all the major participants, various kinds, diplomats, scientists, NGOs, Nobel Prize winners, in November of 2017 at the Vatican. And out of that came a book that we published 2 years ago at a Georgetown Press, A World Free from Nuclear Weapons. And now a second book, which will come out in January of next year, under the title Forbidden, Receiving and Implementing Pope Francis' Condemnation of Nuclear Weapons, which is a collection of moral and pastoral guidance for people within the church, bishops conferences, professors like myself, confessors, spiritual directors, but also for people who have real responsibility for nuclear weapons in their countries or their alliances, as to how can they address the difficult problems now set up by the outright condemnation of these weapons by the Holy Father. I think that one of the important issues that the Holy Father signals in his address to the diplomatic corps, and that he spoke about at length in his 2 years ago in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, brothers and sisters all, is to build up trust. And I'd say that there are various kinds of lack of trust, even among the civil society participants. So at least in my experience of the New York meeting in 2017, there was a tension between the international humanitarian lawyers who were like a school there, who thought that this topic belonged just to them, and anyone, including many lawyers, who wanted to make arguments in moral terms, not just for religious reasons, as we at the Holy See might, or the Iranians might, or some other group with religious roots, but because they felt that the general public understands moral arguments rather than the niceties of international humanitarian law. And I found in the end that the way that those points could be made was by support from inconspicuous states who were less vocal, less noticeable, but nonetheless came up to support a position that had been taken. And over time, they wore down the opposition of the IHL lawyers and what I call the legalist school. Another factor, it seems to me, in the relationship of religious actors like myself and the Holy See, and but civil society and governments, is the relationship at home between state and religion. You can see this particularly in the international UN dialogues, the Alliance of Civilizations, for instance, the Dialogue of Civilizations, and similar dialogues that were set up after 9/11 to deal with interreligious dialogue at the international level. The sponsors of these different groups tend to be sponsors with similar policies towards religion, and particularly those who want to control religion and do control religion directly, tend to gather together. And so that tends to be a kind of factor in these things, is how much independence does religion have in a country, as opposed to how much the Holy See generally said with respect to this kind of interreligious dialogue, they much preferred dealing religion to religion than having religions mediated by the states or international organizations, because there was these elements of control that were part of the historic situation in states. In the case of the US, there's tension because the less religiously literate among US diplomats think of the relations of church and state in the Jeffersonian maxim of the wall of separation. But the wall of separation is not a matter of law. The law under the First Amendment is the law of non-establishment of religion and freedom of exercise of religion. And it's into those domains that religion can be involved in political ways in the US, though the state can't be involved in directing religion. It's an interesting kind of position. But and that has to be explained to US diplomats, I found, in doing my briefings on the Holy See, when diplomats are being sent over there. But just most diplomats just don't understand, at least US diplomats. How is mistrust and resistance to other groups overcome? And I think the first thing I think of is persistence. This 2 years ago, the Holy See two and a half years ago, signed a controversial agreement on the appointment of bishops with China, though the actuality is that for more than 2 decades, it had been informally making appointments of bishops in consultation with the Chinese government. But in any case, it persisted in trying to bring this about. And the Chinese understood that. And I think persistence really counts in diplomacy. They know that you want a relationship. And I'll talk about it as an important instance of the transformation there myself. Secondly, wasting time together can be important. I think of Paul Nitz's walk in the woods with Ambassador Ratifsky, I think his name was, in Geneva, which didn't have any immediate results, but set the U.S. on the path to the Reykjavik agreements, and finally the end of the Cold War and the major disarmament agreements that accompanied it. Spending time just loosely together can make a big difference, and personal favors can make a difference. When I was handling back China negotiations, assisting, and therefore sometimes playing an quasi-independent role, I was asked to provide certain favors for the other party. And we had thought at one point we had set up an arrangement for US medical personnel to be able to go look at senior officials in another country who needed attention. And it was killed by a deputy secretary, or not a deputy, but an undersecretary of defense, despite the approval of the Secretary of State and the White House. But then the other party came back with another request. Would I help the son of an intermediary take a look at Georgetown? He was looking at colleges at that point. And so I said, gladly. So we showed him around. He had a great visit. He eventually decided to come here, became both a foreign service and theology major. And I was told when he was admitted to Georgetown that then I had become family. I was good as family. So, and that was really quite a change, because only a few years before, there'd been a delegation in this country where the delegation dealt amicably with lay members of our conversation. When I got up to speak and ask less of them than the lay members had, the delegation rose up in a chorus against me and derided me. But then, as it looked like we were building these negotiations, I was approved to be a to be an intermediary and further to tour 4 cities. So the result, I think, was of being able to look for a way in which to make a connection was much rewarded. I think the biggest challenge in the area of overcoming mistrust of international organizations and diplomacy is holding governments to their commitments. Professor Hernan, our ambassador, Hernan Portocarrero, has already spoken about pacta sunt servanda, the ancient maxim, agreements must be observed. And I think that states have to do a better job. And it seems to me that one of the jobs of diplomats and retired diplomats is to hold their governments accountable to the agreements that are made in the past. It has to be if we're to overcome this period of disenchantment with diplomacy and fear of negotiation. We need to hold to the existing agreements and rebuild them when they've eroded away. Finally, I have 3 lessons I take away from Vatican diplomacy. The first is the importance of cultural competence. I think it's really important to be able to relate to the culture of your interlocutor. I think one of the things that's made it possible for China and the Vatican to come to agreement under Pope Francis, despite years of trying to do so before, and with genuine effort, is that the Chinese remembered the Jesuit presence in China in the 17th and early 18th centuries, and honor still to this day with public memorials the Jesuits who brought the West to China and honored Chinese culture. One went so well as to become a equivalent to the prime minister, and others were tutors to the emperor. But the reason was they understood and respected Chinese culture. And I think they remember that in the Jesuit tradition of Pope Francis, but also Francis has used that to show respect for Chinese culture and understands it as a civilizational state. And I think that really has made a difference. The Vatican also did kindnesses at the time of natural disaster, that send relatively small philanthropic gifts, but gifts to show their concern for the Chinese people, and involved the Chinese in the deliberations that led to Laudato Si, the famous encyclical on the environment. Excuse me. And I'm told by well-informed people that still is a very important relationship between the Vatican and Beijing on the environment. I think finally, there's a need to correct the structural inequalities that exist in formal institutions, both beginning with the practice. I think the kind of ham-fistedness we saw at the NPT in 2015 or at the WTO can't continue to persist. And we must support efforts like the Conference to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons to move around those kind of practices. But diplomats must see it as their responsibility not to engage in those domineering practices, but to understand their interlocutors and show them respect in the kind of agreements they come to, rather than imposing a view on them. I think, secondly, there needs to be institutional reform of the architecture of international institutions. So, I mean, I think the inequality in the NPT between what I call the legacy states, the P5, but also the protection of those on the outside, like Israel and India. It seems to me is important that there needs to be greater equality on the issue and greater equality in the practice of the institution. And then finally, of course, the great Gordian knot the veto and the P5 and the Security Council will finally have to be corrected. But in the meantime, change in practice, I think, can really make changes overall in the levels of trust between nations and multilateral negotiations. And finally, I would say the inclusion of civil society is a great step forward, and we need to see more of that. We need to see new mechanisms devised for implementing that, because it seems to me that it gives a greater sense of legitimacy and participation and greater support to the institutions. As one American political scientist has said, and former diplomat, we're no longer in a world of the chessboard. We're now in the world of the web. And that's a multidimensional world, and civil society is an important part of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Drew. And thank our three presenters for a very rich panoply of issues, impediments, what works, what doesn't, etc. Given the time, I'm going to ask if any of our presenters want to make a brief comment on the issues that have been presented here. And if not, we will move then directly to a couple of questions.
Can I make a very brief comment?
Yes, Ernam.
Both on things that Ambassador White has said and Father Christensen as well. I spent a lot of my professional life in the United Nations, both in New York and occasionally in Geneva and elsewhere. And I've had the impression that there was a sclerosis of the institutional framework, not just the Security Council, which has often been powerless, peacekeeping, where I've witnessed firsthand debacles in Rwanda and in the Balkans. My impression in my later years at the UN was that the major conferences were actually taking over from the institutional machinery. And that is both a good evolution because you get public opinion on board. With all due respect, what happens on a day-to-day basis in the General Assembly generates very little interest. But the conferences on climate change, on sustainable development, on the status of women, these do generate interest of public opinion, the press, and involve more and more civil society, which is the point made by Father Christensen. I think it's going to be very difficult and take a long time to reform the key institutions of the UN. The General Assembly, of course, is a necessity because it's where sovereign equality exists as a fiction, as a legal fiction. But for all practical purposes, I think that since 1992, little by little, step by step, the major conferences have taken over from my point of view. And I've spent, God knows how many years of my life I've spent in those meeting rooms, often underground in New York, or come out of the building at 2 a.m. I do think that the major conferences have somewhat taken over the institutional machinery. Thank you.
Drew? Unmute. Can you unmute? There, okay. No.
There we go.
Now.
I'd like to ask Elaine if she'd raise the curtain a little bit on one of the mysteries for me still of the conference on prohibition, and that is how did you arrive at a text after the small groups had discussed controverted issues and different alternative proposals to a particular topic? What went on in that back room where you came up with a draft for the next morning?
Thank you. I will make reference to this question. I wanted to also make reference to Ambassador Portocarrero's comment on the dynamics of the conference, ad hoc conference, thematic conference, and the regular institutional framework. I have the impression that they are not necessarily in opposite or in competition, but I think the ad hoc conferences are an instrument that has been developed by the General Assembly to address complex issues, among other things, because let us remember that when the UN was being crafted, was being negotiated in San Francisco, one of the proposals by the US was that there should be a lawmaking body within the UN, but that was not agreed upon, right? So instead, the General Assembly, nevertheless, has been able to create different mechanisms, such as negotiating conferences that work on the treaty on, on the law of the treaties, to actually generate treaties. I mean, it has created mechanisms to put to the service of humanity lawmaking powers, and also to put to the service of humanity by means of this ad hoc conference machinery, different solutions to global problems. So I think they intertwine. And well, I wanted to make that comment. And that was one of the reasons why the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons became a reality, through the a very fine management of the institutional procedures of the UN by this coalition of states, together with the civil society organizations and the victims. And so coalitions nowadays, as you have pointed out, are not only composed of states, but also of scientists and civil society organizations overall. Now, regarding the way in which the text was drafted and crafted, we would have to say that there were different stages. Let us recall that after one overall discussion of 1 week, then as president, I presented the first draft based on what I perceived, interpreted was the level of convergence in the room regarding the different topics that were discussed in the first session. That draft was reviewed. We did a reading of the first draft in conference mode. And after that first reading, I presented yet another, a revised text. So we were bringing together or exhausting aspects that had not been object of convergence. And by discussing in the plenaries, we could arrive at more convergence on those topics that had not been discussed enough. But there is a time in which you identify and you leave towards the end those topics that need further negotiation. And that's when we had the breakup sessions to negotiate very specific parts of the text. For instance, I myself chaired the negotiations on Article 1, that was the prohibition. And over there were 2 or 3 aspects that were contentious issues. So what happened at the end to have an overall text is that every coordinator of the breakup group gave me the result of the work of that group. That is the consensus that group arrived to. And with that we finalized the parts that were being left for the final negotiation touch-ups. That's how we had a text that was submitted to the last reading, I think like 3 days before the adoption. And that was the most difficult, I think the most difficult session, because countries still, delegates always expect to be able to make changes, but it was not possible to make changes at the last minute, because then we would not have been able to meet the times of the back office, right? All the negotiations that need to be, I mean, all the translation, all the legal revisions, everything. We needed time for that. So there was a time in which, as president, I could not take any more.
But then you grant them an explanation of vote after the vote.
Oh yes, then everybody, exactly. Everybody then, after the adoption, they, they take the floor and they give their explanation, vote before the vote or after the vote. Actually, I think it was after the vote mostly. Mm-hmm. But already know how things are done. And then of course, then countries, I mean, this is very interesting, but it's when you have a product that is the result of the interaction between all delegations, but it's not, it's a common, it's a collective work. It is not one vision. So nobody really feels that whatever is in the text is only my vision or only the other party's vision. So I think most of very experienced negotiators always say that if everybody is unsatisfied, that means that there's a good agreement, because nobody can feel that they completely own the final product.
Thank you very much. There is one long question, which I will read from John McAuliffe. Any one of you who feels ready and willing to answer it can do so. I would like to pose a different kind of negotiations involving Cuba, achieving release of the 700 imprisoned July 11th, 12th protesters. Precedents are POWs from the Bay of Pigs, Alan Gross, and the 75 convicted during the Black Spring in Cuba. The Vatican and Spain achieved the last cited release, although it took 8 years. Cuba blames the US for creating the conditions of hardship that led to the protests. For example, the embargo and Biden's continuation of Trump's destruction of Obama's openings. While the US does not have to accept that premise, the Cubans might accept the undoing of the conditions as the basis for releases. Does anyone want to answer that or
I think
offer an opinion?
I'm the only Cuban in the room, I think.
Yes.
2 or 3 points. First of all, the Cuban position is that there are practically no political prisoners in Cuba. It's all common criminals, because they always invoke 2 articles of the criminal code, as you know, propaganda enemiga, desacato. So when you come out publicly with the idea that there are political prisoners, it's counterproductive. I've always felt that in such cases, what you need is discreet diplomacy. On human rights issues in general, we have to come to the barricades, and God knows that I've done that in Havana. But if you want to help individual cases, discreet diplomacy is much better, because again, it's the question that they may be not, the government doesn't want to lose face, they don't want to admit that they have overreacted. And it's always difficult for a diplomat to see how far to go on individual cases, because often it's counterproductive when you put too much public pressure. That is my personal experience. And now, I have to say, with all the love I have for Cuba, that of course there has been an overreaction. And I will quote a Cuban colleague of mine, one of my interlocutors at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who quoted one of the generals of the independence struggle. I think it was Máximo Gómez. El cubano no llega o se pasa. Cubans either don't go far enough or they overdo it. And that was at a certain moment when the government was taking measures against foreign NGOs. And then again, I tried to mediate discreetly and got certain things done. People that had been expelled were allowed to return. The modus operandi of the NGOs was adapted, etc. But again, this was discreet diplomacy. One little secret that I will give away at some point in time, when the Black Spring prisoners were released and allowed to go into exile, this was something that was negotiated between then Cardinal Ortega and Raúl Castro. And Ortega told me later that Raúl was afraid that he had to go and tell Fidel what he had agreed to, although Fidel had long been retired. But again, this shows that the system is, first of all, concerned with image. And as I said in my introduction, psychological elements are extremely important in any negotiation. I hope, of course, that especially the young people that are now popping long sentences for street protests will find some form of leniency. I think once the dust is settled, the Cubans will probably reconsider, because they are also aware what this does to their image internationally. But again, there is public diplomacy on human rights principles, and there is, from my experience, much better discreet diplomacy on individual cases.
Thank you, Hernan. If there is no final comments from any of our panelists, I will thank them all for doing an extraordinarily fine job in laying out the issues, etc. And not just Hernan, but all of you for staying up late to do so. As a matter of fact, this webinar has been recorded. In about 2 weeks, it will be up on the Cuba Program's website at Columbia University. And in addition, we post all of our webinars on YouTube. So if you have people who say to you, oh, I really wanted to hear that webinar, we will send you the link when we have it posted, and you can pass it on. And we are deeply appreciative of all of the work that you did, not only in terms of preparation, but also this evening. And the thanks of Columbia University and the Cuba program, as well as the Institute for Latin American Studies, to all three of you, and to Ellen Johnson, who's hiding over there, who did all of the technology, etc. So
thank you to all of you, and it was an honor to be invited. Thank you, Meg.
It's good to be
you're
with you
welcome,
all.
and thank you to our audience too.
Thank you all.
That's
Bye,
Ellen.
everyone.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you all.
Take
Thank you.
care, Ambassador.
Good night.
Father Christians, take care.
Bye-bye.